The Strategic Defence Review was all part of what the government says is Britain transitioning to a state of war readiness. So what would a state-on-state war involving NATO look like in 2025? Well, first, it'll obviously be significantly different from even modern 20th century conflicts like the Gulf War, Iraq or Afghanistan. This would involve far more advanced military tech, cyber and grey zone operations, and come with the risk of nuclear escalation. And it could of course spread to other parts of the world if China, for instance, took advantage of the chaos. So how might things start? Well, the most likely scenario at the moment, one NATO is focused on, is that Russia launches some sort of multi-front invasion into the Baltics, using Belarus as a staging ground. Germany's Chief of Defence, General Carsten Brewer, has predicted Russia could attack a NATO Baltic state by the end of the decade, particularly if the US withdraws some of the 85,000 American troops currently stationed in Europe. And this is where he believes it could happen. This is the Suwalki Gap, a 40-mile corridor that links Russia via Belarus with the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, a tiny pocket of Russian territory on the Baltic coast. If the Russians sever this, they'd effectively cut off the Baltic states from the rest of Europe. So how might this unfold? Well, as a precursor, Russia might launch cyber attacks on the Baltic states to crash their banking systems, their communication networks, and their energy infrastructure. NATO does have what's been called a tripwire force in the Baltics of around 5,000 troops, but a study back in 2016 concluded they would probably be quickly overrun by the sheer mass of the Russian army, and Russian forces could reach the capitals of Estonia and Latvia within 60 hours. But that, of course, was before Ukraine and the enormous losses Russia has suffered. Right now, that wouldn't be the case, but Russia is rearming, and the thinking is that by the end of this decade, they'll have rebuilt their army enough to make that scenario possible again. So if they did invade, the Russians would probably mine the Baltic ports, as they've done in Ukraine, to stop any sort of amphibious assault. At the same time, the Kremlin might strike NATO bases and airfields in Poland, Germany and Lithuania with cruise missiles and drones. One of the Baltic states, probably Lithuania, would quickly invoke Article 5, the principle of collective defence. Then NATO would be at war. The first unit NATO would deploy would be the Allied Reaction Force, a 10,000-strong multinational army that NATO says can be quickly scaled to 300,000 troops if needed. At the same time, the skies above the Baltics would be flooded with NATO jets. At this point, Kaliningrad, sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania, and already bristling with Iskander missile launches, becomes particularly important for Moscow because it gives the Kremlin a launch site right in the heart of the war zone. Russia could even up the ante by moving tactical nuclear weapons to Kaliningrad. That in turn could prompt the US and NATO allies to move their own nuclear forces to a higher state of readiness, possibly DEFCON 3, 2 steps from all-out nuclear war. At sea, NATO's navies would increase their presence in the North Atlantic, the Baltics and the Mediterranean to secure vital supply routes. While on the ground, there could be intense land battles with NATO tanks like British Challengers, US Abrams and German Leopards facing Russian T-80s and T-90s. As time went on, we could see US bombers based in the UK hitting Russian supply depots in Belarus and NATO jets striking deep into Russian territory. This would be a technological conflict, with both sides putting into practice lessons from Ukraine. Drones would feature heavily, along with electronic warfare, to try and suppress each other's air defense systems and command nodes. There might be cyber attacks on power grids, hospitals and government IT systems. Banking and communication networks in NATO countries would also be a target, along with satellites and GPS. Nearly 20% of the UK economy depends on satellites, and around £8 billion of UK GDP would be lost if satellite navigation services went down for just a week. The other thing we'd see would be attacks in the so-called grey zone, things like disinformation campaigns to try and stir up unrest in NATO countries. If this was a war between NATO and Russia, there would be the risk of nuclear escalation. Most alliance members don't have nuclear weapons, but the US, UK, France, and of course Russia do. If Vladimir Putin thought his regime was threatened, if NATO tanks were heading towards Moscow, the risk of Russia launching a nuclear strike would certainly increase. And then there's the civilian cost of any state-on-state conflict. Thousands, possibly millions of refugees would flow from the Baltics, which would put enormous pressure on neighbouring countries and their economies. And the end game of all this? Well, militarily, the 32 NATO members have a huge conventional military power, but they also have shortages of ammunition, defence industries that aren't that integrated, and not enough air defence cover. Russia has surged its military spending to 6% of GDP, quadrupling its defence budget, and Vladimir Putin has enlarged the Russian military to 1.5 million personnel. But that's still 2 million less than NATO can muster. Russia has around 5,000 aircraft. The alliance has 22,000 of them. NATO's tank stocks run to 11,500. Russia has around half that number. In a conventional war against Russia, the alliance would quickly prevail. Better training, better weapons, better command structures. But it could be very costly. Military experts put the loss rates in modern peer-to-peer warfare at 1 to 2,000 a day. Based on a 3-to-1 wound-to-kill ratio and taking into account Russian losses in Ukraine against superior Western weaponry, 3 weeks of heavy combat could cost the lives of 18,000 NATO soldiers and 35,000 Russians. Tens of thousands of civilians could also die through missile strikes and urban fighting. So it would be devastating, but that of course is a conventional war. The one area Russia does match the West is its nuclear arsenal. Cornered and at risk of losing power, Vladimir Putin could push the button on tactical nukes, and that would take things into a whole new realm.
Thanks for watching. For more from BFBS Forces News, like and subscribe to our channel.